Hope everybody's doing well. Welcome, welcome. Glad that everybody has been able to make it. We are excited to be able to host this. Uh, and let me start by giving introductions to who I am. My name is Chioma Inaji. I am the director at the Multicultural AIDS Coalition. We are a nonprofit organization providing HIV services to diverse communities of color, primarily Black and Latinx communities in Boston, Massachusetts. And we are the convener of United We Rise. And United We Rise is excited to be hosting this webinar. If you haven't done already, please go ahead and type in the chat your name, your pronoun, if you prefer, um, organization, and city or state. We want to know who's in the room. We had a lot of signups from across the US as an opportunity for folks to really dive in this couch conversation. Uh, and our couch conversation is called Doing Right by our community. And this is part one of a two-part series. And we are thankful that Francisco Ruiz is with us. And you all are going to hear a lot from him and really engage in conversation about some critical issues that I know is at the top of the mind for you, and definitely some of the work that United We Rise is doing. I want to start by giving a brief overview of United We Rise. If you have not heard about United We Rise, we've been around. I'm sure you all recognize some of the faces in here. We do work now. I know this picture looks like we're all fun, but we do work. United We Rise has been around for the past 4 years, really started off as thinking we're going to put together a one-time conference that was going to focus on policy. And when everybody got in the room, we were like, no, we actually need to be thinking about more around being a collaborative that focuses on how do we reimagine a pathway to end the HIV epidemic for Black folks, and not only thinking about Black people who are impacted by HIV, including individuals living with HIV, but also just about Black liberation, joy, and health. And so we've been together for about 4 years. Each year we have a dynamic planning committee that is leading the effort. And our big defining question has been, what would the response to HIV look like if it was led by Black people? And with that, we take on an approach that when we say Black people, we're talking about every Black body and all the various identities that we hold, and all the places in which we live, and all the ways in which we live. And so we honor the history of the Black diaspora, in the diversity of the Black diaspora. We embody liberation, and we think about liberation in terms of, yes, the systems that do not value us, but also those internal struggles that we have within our Black community that we need to unpack and actually release ourselves of those internalized stereotypes. We also talk about every Black body, understanding that although there is a collective way in which Black people operate and integrate within this world, there are individual experiences. And so Blackness is not just about that collective, but it's also about how we have experienced this world individually. And lastly, every Black body, again, is about a coalition effort. We have individuals who are living with HIV. We have researchers, providers. We have CEOs. We have activists. We have all the folks at the table building this coalition. And so the aim is not another organization. The aim is really, there are already folks doing work. How do we collectively do that work? Here are some of our key ideals around Blackness, intersectionality, and liberation. And I think I've already said a little bit about all of them. And lastly, I just want to show what our focus areas are. And so within the first year that we were together, We really took that time to identify what does it mean, every Black body, what are the key areas that need to be focused on in order to end HIV for every Black body. And these are the 5 areas: community engagement, making sure that we're always leading with an intersectional approach, leadership, what does Black principled leadership look like and mean, policy, um, thinking about intersectional policy, and then making sure that we're centering sexuality and gender identity. So now I want to hand it over to our discussants today, and they're going to run the show from this point on. I've learned a lot from both of these individuals personally, and I'm excited to see how they lead us in an amazing discussion with Director Ruiz. So I'm going to hand it over to Ms. Venita Ray and Dr. Tyler TerMeer.
Thanks so much, Chioma. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. As Chioma said, my name is Dr. Tyler TerMeer. I use he, him pronouns, and I proudly have been serving as a member of United We Rise over the last year and a half, and in my everyday capacity, serve as the first Black and openly HIV positive CEO of San Francisco AIDS Foundation. My co-facilitator today is a brilliant community leader, a movement shaker and shaper and activist, my friend, Miss Venita Ray. Do you want to say hi and introduce yourself?
Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. I'm joining you from Puerto Viejo, Costa Rica. Happy to be here. This conversation was important to me, and I want to thank the planning committee for even selecting us to moderate this important conversation, because we are a leaderful movement and there are plenty of other people who could have did this. And so I run Black South Rising, but I also do work with AIDS United under their Southern HIV Impact Fund and a variety of hats. So back to you. I'm glad to be here.
Thanks so much. We are just so thrilled that all of you have agreed to join us here today. We're hoping that you'll sit back and cozy up as we have this couch conversation. But before we introduce our esteemed guest, I wanted to just provide a little bit of context on the UWR Couch Conversations series. As much of you know, or as many of you probably know, family conversations on the couch or even around the kitchen table hold a really deep cultural significance in Black and Latina communities because they serve as a vital space for connection and tradition and resilience. And these gatherings are often where stories are passed down, where our cultural values are reinforced, and our collective memory is preserved. And in many Black and Latina households, these conversations are what are providing us a safe space to discuss everything from our daily struggles to our dreams and our aspirations and how we'll move through the movement, often in the face of societal challenges that can make these types of intimate conversations feel even more crucial. So that's why United We Rise launched our virtual couch conversation series earlier this year, in order to create safe and intimate opportunities for us to come together and to support the lives of every Black body in our journey to ending the epidemic and in our fight for Black liberation. It's also important that we note that historically, these moments around the couch have been essential for survival, acting as a means of fostering solidarity and nurturing a sense of identity and belonging for us as Black and Brown people. They offer us a chance to share wisdom across generations and our movement, to teach lessons that may not be learned anywhere else except in the safety of these places, and to cultivate a strong sense of community, whether it's something as simple as sharing a meal or simply talking about the events that are happening in our movement. These are the conversations that are forming our cultural sustenance, that are helping us keep the ties that bind us as a chosen family, and that are keeping our community strong despite the external pressures around us. And in this particular moment, when we as Black and Brown people are not only just in the fight of our lives, but the fight for our lives, we have to show up bolder and bigger and be able to draw from our collective resistance as we build and repair at the same time. Because united, in fact, we will rise. So our guest today is the new White House Director of the Office of National AIDS Policy. And while he's new to this role, and maybe a new face for some of you, he is no stranger to our movement or to Venita or I. And I'm so thrilled to introduce our friend and colleague and the new ONAP director, Francisco Ruiz. So maybe to get us started, Francisco, you could just share with us a little bit about your background and your journey that led you to this moment in your current role with the White House.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Before I get started, I just want to sort of thank and sort of in gratitude to be able to share space with you and share the sofa with you, virtually at least. Unfortunately, actually, I'm not on my sofa. I'm still at the office, as I'm sure many of you are still. But we'll keep it cute and say that we're on the couch chilling. But I think today more than ever, we must remain committed in solidarity, and I think we've seen in history, right? When Black and Brown folks come together, we bear fruit of success. And so, that's something that I cherish in this position and humbled to be in this position, leaning on the shoulders of many Black gay men that came before me, Black transgender, cisgender women who came before me to allow me to be where I'm at today. And so I think in these years that I've been working, I have had a lot of mentors and leaders who sort of pulled me up as a little brown boy growing up in this work to say, hey, you also matter. You also need to be at the table. So I think this sort of conversation is sort of spirit of that, that our identities are our strengths, that our unity is our power and that courage is our legacy. And so I think across our Black and brown bodies and lives, I think it really matters to sort of pull us together because when one community is down, we're all down. And so I think just wanted to start with that and just thank you for allowing me to share space with you guys and really look forward to the conversations. I think in terms of my journey in this work, this all kind of, for me, in terms of the HIV space and the journey started about 30 years ago. And in those 30 years, I want to highlight sort of 5 key years. And I think that's really important because, my LinkedIn has my credentials and I want you guys to know a little bit more beyond the alphabets, beyond my titles, but really learn a little bit more about me and sort of how I got to and how I sort of approached the work, right? And so 30 years ago, actually this year, 1994, you guys may recall the third season of The Real World San Francisco was aired on June 30th. And so, who remembers the sort of the narration given over the opening title? This is a true story of 7 strangers picked to live in a house, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was a young boy in Chicago, sort of growing up, sort of figuring out who I was and who I loved. And as you may recall, there was one cast member, Pedro Zamora, who was 22 years old at the time, Cuban American from Miami. He was the first openly gay man to live with HIV, to be portrayed on TV. He brought a lot of international attention to HIV and as well as LGBTQ issues. And even those who are sort of familiar with the show remember that he actually got married before that was even sort of a thing on air with his partner. But then also hours after the final episode of the Real World show, it was announced that he passed away, again at the age of 22. So for me, that show filled me with so much hope, but also fear, right? As a young person growing up. Hope that I was not alone, that this is okay to love, for 2 beautiful men to love each other and to sort of share space and to grow together. But also fear that there's this thing out there, right? That I wasn't even learning about at school, but I saw on TV that kind of lingered in the shadows, right? And so that was sort of my entry point into HIV. Again, sort of the juxtaposition of hope and fear. And then fast forward in 2001, after undergrad, I joined the Peace Corps. So as many of you know, PEPFAR, as a PEPFAR partner, many Peace Corps volunteers are trained to do sort of advocacy and education in HIV in their country, right? And so that was sort of my first job, actually rolling up my sleeves and doing sort of, here's how you put on a condom, and this is what HIV is, and this is what it spells out, and this is how you prevent it. And so that was sort of my entry point into the actual work. But the ironic twist was people with HIV at the time could not apply to be Peace Corps volunteers. You would be medically discharged if you tested positive during your time in the program. So my Peace Corps years were the most defining in my life. I learned so much about myself, met incredible people. It fueled my passion in the work. However, it surfaced some contradictions, right? I was part of an institution that welcomed the science, but didn't welcome the people. And so that changed, as many of you know, in 2008, right? And so that took me sort of, I'm doing this work and I care about this work, but this organization that I work for is saying, hey, if you get this though, you must leave. And so I sort of carried that contradiction with me as I entered my career, went back to school. And then in 2013, I started working at CDC. And so for me, CDC was sort of a privilege, right, to represent communities that often weren't at the table. And even to this day, I know that the representation of Latinos, for example, at CDC is not comparable to the population. And so that's still an issue, not only CDC, but many of our institutions that we know. And that is true for Black people, right? And so making sure that we have representation within the government. And so I was able to sort of be at the table, contribute. But then 2018, while working at CDC, I myself was diagnosed with HIV. And so in 2018, I was also sort of reminded that there's a human aspect to this work, but there's also a human aspect to HIV. And so, you know, it was a very humbling time in my life. I was ironically at that time working at CDC at a campaign around stigma. But when I was diagnosed, I wasn't able to sort of share with anybody because I was sort of dealing with that internalized stigma. And so there was a lot of, again, more contradiction, more confusion, more sort of stigma, discrimination that I was sort of internalized. And then I was finally, you know, and I knew that I was going to be fine because I had family that loved me. I had health insurance, but it was still the societal piece that sort of was sort of not allowing me to sort of do the work or to sort of speak out, even though I was doing the work. And then, you know, in that work, it sort of really reminded me that there's a lot of work that needs to happen, right? We need to move beyond just the science of this. And thankfully, the science has evolved so much. But there's a lot of other work that has equal importance to when we talk about HIV. We need to talk about HIV in terms of stigma and discrimination. What does it mean to love with HIV? Not only others, but yourself. And then in 2024, a few months ago, I was appointed to this position. And so this was another sort of moment of like, hey, this is an opportunity to sort of lean into some of the challenges that I faced in my life, in my trajectory, and sort of represent communities. And so that's sort of been the journey. Again, started 30 years ago, just me sitting in the living room probably on a couch, watching the real world, to now sitting at the White House and sort of speaking with you guys about the work that needs to happen still, and the great work that has happened, but also the work that needs to happen.
I am so proud of you. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that at this point since you're the director at the White House, but you know, many of us have known Francisco for so long, and both the professional and personal journey that you have gone on over the last decade in particular, and what you represent for so many people who are living with HIV and who are working in this field is just so incredibly powerful. So I'm thrilled to share space with you again today. And for people to get to know the amazing leader that you have been in this field. Venita, do you want to jump in with the next question?
Sure. Thank you for that, Francisco. And one of the things I did not do when I introduced myself, I was diagnosed with HIV in 2003. I never say how long I'm living with it because I really don't know, but 2003, and it changed the course of my life because of the way that I had dealt with it. So it is a pleasure to share space, even virtual space, with my people because we are. But and thank you for sharing what you shared. And I did appreciate the human aspect of what you shared. And we've had other ONAP directors who were living with HIV as well. But what is, and I know you got a thing November versus after, but what, and yeah, we're all looking because we're going to be positive in 2025. What is your overarching vision, either before November or is it the same after? I'd love to know, what is your overarching vision for your role, and how do you see influencing the national HIV/AIDS policies that are coming forth?
Thank you, Venita. I think, as I entered it in April, right? Understanding that November was just around the corner, and now it's even closer. But so part of me is sort of striking that balance of like recognizing that November is there, but also know that but like to your point, Venita, before November, during November, post-November, the work needs to continue, right? We know that public health and HIV should not be tied to an election. It should not be tied to a party. And so I think for me, while I have that sort of that on the radar, I have sort of organized myself in thinking through what are some immediate actions that we can work on, how can we continue the momentum, because we've had some progress as we talked about in the sort of opening comments, but there's still some more momentum, right? And so the progress needs to be met with everybody, right? And so how I've thought about it is sort of putting it in sort of 3 buckets, if you will, or 3 sort of categories. And under those, I have sort of discrete things that I've been working with a lot of community members like yourselves, as well as federal partners. And so the 3 areas that I've identified for the next 6 months, and these are going to continue to evolve, right? As things should, as we have additional conversations, as science progresses, nothing should be static. And so these are sort of things that I sort of put together in the conversations that I've been having over the course of the months. So they're really looking at centering science, accelerating our progress, and unapologetically advancing health equity. And again, these 3 are sort of shouldn't be sort of tied to an election or a month, if you will. And when I talk about centering science, I'm really talking about updating policies based on the latest scientific evidence, right? We know, the administration is committed to ensuring our policies are grounded in science, not in fear. So we must, look at how do we embrace and advance science. And some examples that we've seen already with FDA's change in their blood donation. We've seen some other ways that we've sort of advanced the policies, both small P's and big P's. We know the importance of U equals U, undetectable equals untransmittable, and how that has shaped and really revolutionized how we look at ourselves, but also the actual science, right? And so I think our policy needs to be sort of updated. And so I'm working on looking at employment policies, conducting an assessment across the federal government to update outdated policies related to employment eligibility for people with HIV, looking at things like organ transplant and clinical trial guidelines, making sure that people living with HIV have access to the life-saving procedures that we should all have access to. Looking at health education curricula, making sure our young people are getting accurate, non-discriminatory information. So working with the Department of Education, as well as at the local level. And then the one that I know this group is very passionate about as well is HIV criminalization, looking at working with our partners to assess and modernize laws that criminalize HIV status, ensure they're based on current knowledge of science and not perpetuate stigma or injustice. So those are sort of the area around centering the science and not the fear that I've been sort of organizing myself. And I've been doing this, again, in collaboration with community members, people of lived experience, but also across the federal government. And I think those levers in some of these areas are at the federal level, and some of these are also at the local level. So it's going to take a lot of folks on this call to also sort of push within their sphere of influence at the local level, because it doesn't all happen, as you know, at the federal level. And so and then the other bucket is really accelerating our progress. We've seen recent surveillance reports. We know that there has been some progress, but we also know the progress hasn't been where we want it to be. And it's not reaching all communities. And so we must sort of continue, sort of stand firm, like, hey, in most cases, it's going in the right direction. We need how do we put some little espresso shots in that to make it go faster? And how do we make sure that everyone is witnessing and experiencing the progress that we have in the science? Because we have the tools. We always welcome more tools, but we have solid tools that we know work. How do we make sure everyone has access to that? And so some examples in this sort of bucket, if you will, is looking at viral suppression, making sure that we have tailored interventions that is developed by Black and brown bodies, kind of making sure that they're indigenous to the communities that they're serving, and that we expand access to antiretroviral therapy, comprehensive support services. We know that this work is not just about a pill or a shot. It's about all these other things that put us, you know, in places where we can't have access to housing, employment, mental health services. And so all those pieces, you know, the syndemics, addressing the interconnected epidemics, and how do we adopt holistic intersectional responses? I know that's one of the questions that we're going to talk about, intersectionality, but how do we sort of serve the whole person, not just sort of a health condition? The other piece around accelerating the progress is that we know there's been a lot of great research happening at various agencies across the government. How do we sort of expedite and streamline the translation of HIV research into effective programs and policies? And so I'm working with colleagues at the federal level and at the research institutions. How do we sort of bring research to practice? And then the other thing that I know that many of you on this call are passionate about is making sure we have congressional champions, right? This work, as you know, a lot of times via the budget or whatever, what have you, we need leaders on the Hill who are going to be championing the work that needs to happen. And so we need to continue to lay the groundwork for congressional champions of HIV. We've had historically bipartisan support. We've also had champions who've been leading the calls like the Maxine Waters and the Barbara Lees. We need to continue to like lean on their shoulders, but also bring in some new folks into the mix and see who else could help champion this cause. And the last bucket, and I know that I've been talking a lot, so I apologize, but is really sort of the equity piece, right? Unapologetic. The next iteration of the National AIDS Strategy, I want to really focus on equity. But when I talk about equity, I'm talking about equity in regards to race, ethnicity, also age. We know HIV and aging is a huge issue. We know that a majority of people with HIV are over 50, and that number is only getting larger. And so how do we continue efforts across the federal government that are already happening, but how do we sort of strengthen and fine tune some of the programs that we know need some fine tuning, and also adjust or address some gap issues in terms of the services of the programs that we have for older Americans. PrEP access is a huge issue. I talked about viral suppression, but we also know the prevention side of the work is really important. So how do we collaborate across federal agencies to increase PrEP accessibility and affordability? We can't, it's great if we have accessibility, but we also have to talk about affordability. And I know the administration has been looking at drug pricing and other things to make sure that folks have access to the life-saving medicine that we have. HIV workforce pipeline. 2 weeks ago, we had a summit in DC at the White House, and we brought in 54 young Black, brown, queer young people who are in the HIV workforce space, and said, hey, you matter. We see you, we value you, and we passed the mic to them. We heard about what they see as innovation from their vantage point, what they need to be successful in this work. And so I think the HIV workforce is really, really key. And thinking about it holistically, it's not just the traditional workforce. We brought in folks who are like dancers in the art, people who are lawyers, and bringing everyone in, and how do we sort of sustain and support them? But also, how do we sustain and support our existing workforce? Our workforce in HIV has been taxed with COVID, and then there's Mpox, and then they're still supposed to maintain the HIV work, and oh, hey, syndemics, do some other stuff too. So how do we support? What incentives can we develop to really make sure that folks come into this space to work alongside us, but also stay with us? And then the last, in terms of equity, is really bringing in leaders across the Black and brown community that are not, quote unquote, traditional organizations. And so one of the focus areas that I have is bringing in national organizations, local organizations that are doing other things that we know is important to us, or that have the eyes and ears of our community. I think oftentimes in this work, we kind of stay in the HIV bubble, if you will. We kind of speak to each other. And I think there is a lot of importance to that, to learn from each other, solidarity. But it's also important to bring this conversation to new spaces, to bring in new people. If we're trying to get more people on PrEP that maybe don't know about it, we kind of have to go to them, right? But we need I know we do that in our work in terms of mobile clinics, but also on the policy side, we need to do that as well. We need to bring this policy discussion and keep bringing new people to this mix. And how does HIV policy connect with housing, economic mobility, education? And so that's sort of one of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of engaging non-traditional partners. So those are sort of how I've been conceptualizing the next 6 months, these buckets, leaning into many of you in this space. A lot of these came from ideas that you've shared with me in conversations that I've had on the couch, at coffee stops. So I hope that answered your question, Venita.
It did, and I was happy to hear about centering science, and we have the tools. And I want to say this because those tools alone won't get us to the end because we've had those tools. So I want to hear not today, just today, but about how we apply those tools and what else we need to bring culturally and stuff to those communities that are most in need. So I really love that. I want to throw out the HOPE Act when you talked about equity and access, and it's right there. Secretary Becerra just needs to sign something and get that into May. And then criminalization, there's a lot of talk about it. The federal government could lead. They don't do criminalization at the federal level, but they sure have a stick and a carrot with money to make it change. And we talk about stigma, but if we leave those kinds of structural kinds of violence, state-sanctioned violence in place, we don't get there. It's almost like we want to prosecute rather than prevent. So thank you for everything you said, and I applaud you. Equity is huge because Black women, Latinx, all these folks need to be, and so maybe we can get into a conversation later about specifically how, but I love where you're starting. Go ahead, Tyler, y'all know I can go.
No, I mean, that's why I love these types of conversations because they organically grow in the ways that they need to be. I think a lot of what I've heard both of you talk about here in the last couple of minutes is just the complexity of HIV, both the people it impacts, the way our systems have historically been built, and the things that we need to do to ensure that we can correct the mistakes of the past and ensure that people have the equitable access that they need in the future. So, both complexity and considering intersectionality. I myself, I'm the first Black CEO of San Francisco AIDS Foundation. But I'm also a Black person, a queer person, a person who's been living with HIV for 20 years of my life. All of those come into play as I live and breathe in this world, and have set me up for different disparities in my life, a different journey than other folks. And I have the privilege of living as a light-skinned Black person every day, and I know that my experience is different in that way as well. So I guess I'm curious, Francisco, considering intersectionality, considering the complexity, how do you plan to address some of the unique challenges that are faced by Black and Brown folks in your efforts, in your time at the White House?
Yeah, I mean, I think addressing intersectionality is something that I know is key to ending the HIV epidemic, right? And I think in sort of the start of the webinar, you talked about like we need to be at the table if we're going to end. In that conversation, we talk about what does it mean for Black leadership in this space? What does it mean for Black and Brown leadership, right? And so I think one of the things that I've been focusing on, and even taking a step back, while I may be like the first Latino in this position, there's been a lot of great other work that's been happening across the administration for Latinos, right? And so while I'm in this space is new, but when I walk down, the executive office building and I see other Black and Brown leaders in these positions, I mean, I think it's sort of it reminds me like, hey, we are here, and how do we connect? And so my job, so I've been doing this HIV work for a minute, right? As I shared, and what I've learned over the past few months is that this White House is big. There's all these different offices, all these different players, all these potential levers. And so what I've been doing these past few months is trying to figure out meeting with people, right? And sort of that. So that's how when we talk about intersectionality, it's about you can't just have this Office of National AIDS Policy sit in this office and just kind of sit there and do your work. Like it's about opening up that door and keeping it open, walking up to the next door. And so I've been meeting with folks in different offices, figuring out how they're doing. And I think a lot of this work, what I'm learning, is not different than it is how I was at CDC or in the community level, is really finding that synergy when we talk about intersectionality. How can we lean into each other, right? There's layers of the impact of race and socioeconomic status, systemic inequities. Like how do we address, so the beauty of this position, so the ONAP sits within the Domestic Policy Council. So the White House has a bunch of different sort of big groups, and the Domestic Policy Council sees a lot of the different policies that are coming through the White House go through the DPC. And so not only do I have purview of what's the HIV stuff that I'm driving, but also these other things, like I mentioned, like around housing, education. And so I'm able to sort of connect the dots and sort of put in, like, what does this look like for people with HIV? And how could this impact, and how could we strengthen this? And so the way I'm approaching it is not only sort of in the work that I'm doing, is making sure I'm integrating the work and the voices, but also when I see other things come through my desk that don't at surface level look like an HIV thing, making sure that I bring in the voice and the perspectives of our work and how we move forward. And so I think part of that is making sure they're culturally responsive to our the strategies are culturally responsive. Part of that is making sure that when I have a convening at the White House, for example, that our community is there, regardless of the topic area. And so that's something that I've been very committed to, making sure that we can't do this work without centering people with HIV, right? If we're talking about ending the HIV epidemic, we need to make sure people with HIV are there. And so that's one of the work that I'm trying to do. And then the other thing about intersectionality, I know that it became sort of a big buzzword, but like, we are walking proofs of intersectionalities, right? And so when I walk in there, I stand firmly in all my sort of identities and the complexities that come before me. And so when I do the work, it's leaning into what does the Latino Francisco think about this, or the person of color Francisco, or what about the gay, like there's all these different things and how that means and how some of the stigma discrimination is layered into this work. I mean, I think in terms of policy, we need to make sure that we don't inadvertently stigmatize communities when we're putting together these policies. And so I think we talked about criminalization, right? We know that was back in the day was issued in, and we know, I'm not sure what I just dropped, but we know that those policies don't work, right? And so Department of Justice, as you guys probably have seen, has been working on this issue. There's other, CDC has put out some communication and resources. We know a lot of partners on this call have also issued out some resources. And so I think it's going to take all intersectionality for me is like everyone at the table, right? Working on these issues from different sectors, from different vantage points, and addressing it together.
Yeah, I think it's, I'll underscore that everyone working together and remind folks that the Office of National AIDS Policy is an office of one. So Francisco is doing amazing work and really there to help ensure that there is a blueprint that we can all work from and work together on. But it's all of our responsibility to figure out how we continue to lift up ONAP to ensure that that Francisco does have a hallway to walk down and see other partners. That was in question at some point as to the proximity of where the office would be, whether there's a budget for the office to operate. All of that is a part of our movement building as well.
No, is it my turn?
It is.
Thank you for saying all of that, because I think it's just abhorrent that there isn't a staff and more to deal with a problem that we know there's 1.2 million that we guess, and there's way more. So, and would like to partner with you around that. But I want to also ask a quick question too around, I want folks to understand around this intersectionality. When Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw created that, it was to show how those identities, the different forms of oppression those identities bring in the criminal justice system. I'm treated differently. IPV, I'm treated differently. So how, and you can, I believe, can talk about some of that, but without enough of us at the table, we can't, it just can't happen. And versus an event that we come to versus a place that we come and make policy. I want to see that, because intersectionality, you're right, is more than just a buzzword. It's me, a Black, poor, something, and all of those things that make it a barrier and make me vulnerable to HIV and a barrier to get better. So I just want to say that right quick. But I wanted to say, go ahead.
Well, just real quick to add to that, I think 100%, I think, but what I'm trying to do is also use the frame of that intersectionality as an asset for us. So maybe it's sort of like changing it up and say that, like, when I walk into a room, I bring all my intersectionalities in terms of
Yeah, you
my
bring your whole person.
solutions, right?
Yeah.
And so like I lean into a son of immigrants, you know, I lead into sort of being diagnosed with HIV. I lean into having worked in the community and also at the federal level. And so I think intersectionality also, I think, is an asset, right? Like, yes, obviously those issues are what's challenging and are perpetuating, you know, from the structural issues, perpetuating inequities and disparities. But at the same time, what I'm trying to think about is how can we lean into our intersectionality identity or intersectional identities to
Right.
lift up our strengths, right?
Totally agree. Totally agree.
Because
I'm
there
gonna
was
go to the next question because I remember being asked, was I work for an agency, and they say, when you sit there, are you a policy person or you're a Black woman who happens to be an attorney living with HIV activists? And I said, I'm all of those things.
you're like,
What's wrong
yes.
with that? Well, I'm no longer at that organization because that's not what they wanted. So
Right.
they didn't want those identities. So here I'm gonna ask one of United We Rise's intersectional policy areas focuses on dismantling systems that harm Black lives. How do you plan to leverage your position to challenge and change these systemic issues? And you could get into some root cause analysis, whatever, but what do you plan to do?
Yeah, and I think when we talk about inequities, I think we need to also reframe that, right? They're not a result of individual choices, but
No, they're not.
like to your part, of larger structural societal factors, right? And so I think part of addressing those issues is just naming that, right? Making sure we're very explicit about the fact that folks are disproportionately impacted by HIV is not because of individual choice, right? There's things that have put us in places that have, you know, exposure to HIV and other things. And so I think one of it is sort of addressing those policies straight on, or even those notions to be able to address those policies. I think it's challenging. You know, we need to be unapologetic about justice and equity in this work, especially as we talk about HIV. I started this work not with an MPH. I don't have a master's of public health. I entered it from that social justice perspective of when we talk about HIV, we're also talking about homophobia, we're talking about racism, we're talking about all sorts of things, right? And so I think leveraging sort of my position in the White House to be able to have sort of speak power to truth. And I think part of the national HIV strategy, as you all are familiar with, is about the whole of society, right? How do we bring in everybody to the table, and not only community, but also, you know, we have the traditional HHS or agencies in terms of CDC and NIH and, you know, and HRSA and SAMHSA, but there's also the Office of Civil Rights, other places and other players within HHS that are at the table when we're talking about the national HIV strategy. I've already talked about the Department of Justice and their work around sort of pushing back laws that are unjust at the local level. There's the Department of Labor, Department of Education. And so I think part of addressing some of these systemic issues is looking at the systems that are perpetuating these inequities. And so, and unfortunately, there's a lot of them, right? There's a lot of stuff within HHS that we sort of are revisiting. There's a lot of stuff within the areas of Department of Labor, Department of Education. So I think part of addressing some of these is tackling them with those folks, with those individuals. And then HHS, and many of us would probably claim to be sort of partners within the HHS world because we're doing a lot of the HIV work, and that's where a lot of the work is. But also, how do we tap into all the organizations like us that are in the Department of Labor's realm, right? All the organizations that are sort of working on education and educational rights. And so that's where how we start tackling some of these systems when we start uniting in the work. And so, you know, the thing about to Tyler's point, you know, I may be an office of one. You know, I do work within the larger structure, and so I've been really trying to sort of leverage all these other offices. And I think that's the beauty of sort of being in an administration that gets it and values lived experience. And there was a meeting that I was at recently where they actually use lived solutions, which I really loved, because it's like our lived experiences are our lived solutions, right? And how do we lean into that and use those to help inform some of the policies? And so when I'm working, you know, right now we're sort of entering the phase of rewriting the national HIV strategy. So the current strategy, as you guys know, takes us to 2025. And so right now we're starting to roll up our sleeves and thinking through what is the next iterations? What should it look like? What does this roadmap look like? And so we're going to be doing a series of listening sessions. And so we have our first one coming up next week. And so for those of you who will be at the Ryan White conference, we're going to be doing it on Tuesday at 9 o'clock. A little plug. We want to hear from folks. We want to what is working, what is not working, and it's not going to be your traditional like we're going to talk to you. We're basically going to I'll probably say a few words, and then we're just going to have a hot mic, and we really want to hear from folks, because that's how when we talk about intersectionality and dismantling systems, sometimes the system need to be quiet and just listen. And so that's sort of what I'm trying to do in this next year is listen to the community, what is working, what is not working, and then figure out what are some of the gaps in our current strategy, what do we need to change, and we've seen this response in the government was because community was not silent, right? And so I think we need to kind of think through what else do we need to do to make sure that we're sort of addressing some of the challenges that we're seeing at the local level.
I really love that the listening tour strategy is
We
coming.
can't hear you. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I can't hear you.
Oh,
Maybe it's me.
yeah, something happened.
Is it me?
Can you hear me?
Am I the villain?
No. Can you hear me?
I think it is me.
I can hear both of you.
Okay. Tyler, you just put yourself on mute.
Yeah, but I think you can't hear me.
No, we can hear
Yeah,
you.
we
Oh,
can hear you.
Yeah.
Great. I love that. So, one of the things that I'm
Let's
excited-
make sure that Francisco is back on. I think it was his sound that's messed up.
Oh,
the White House blocking me.
Oh, blocking this conversation. Come on now.
I wouldn't doubt it.
All right, we'll give him a second here. How about now, Francisco? Can you hear me now?
I could hear you.
Okay, we
I
can
think
hear
we're
you.
back.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yeah.
can.
All right. Come on, IT.
So I was going to say that, I'm excited to hear that the listening tours are back and in motion, and that you'll be hearing from folks as we look at the next iteration of the National HIV/AIDS strategy. But I guess I'm wondering, beyond listening, what strategies you think you'll employ to ensure that there's increased representation of Black people in decision-making processes, of Black people living with HIV in decision-making processes, particularly those decision-making spaces that are going to be about future HIV and AIDS policy.
I think, it's like I said earlier, like having community who represent the folks that we're serving is key, right? And that is Black, brown, transgender, Black cisgender women. Everyone needs to be at the table. And so we're going to be very intentional. So as you probably know, there's been a lot of, and I think I've seen Venita in some of these, there's been a lot of community engagement sessions, listening sessions. And so what I don't want to do is go back to community and ask the same questions. I want to be very intentional about how we re-engage folks. And so what I asked a lot of our federal partners is to sort of give me some highlights of what they've already heard, and then we build on that, right? And so that way we're not sort of repeating, because y'all are giving us time, you're giving us your wisdom, and I want to make sure that we're using that. So the first step has been sort of look at some of those the feedback sessions that we've already had across the government. And then the second is now going to be sort of doing some of how do we build on that and some of those lessons learned. And so we're going to be doing this in spaces, like I said, next week at Ryan White, where I'm in conversations of doing spaces at a symposium that's going to be focused on HIV and aging and sort of learning about what we can do in that space. USCHA is around the corner, as you guys know, in New Orleans. And so that's a good space to have some Southern perspective, as well as a national, but really hear from the South of what needs to happen differently. And in all these conversations, my goal is to engage people and have co-moderators in the process and help. Again, the idea is not to have presentations. The idea is to listen. And that's sort of what I'm planning to do. And so there's also going to be an opportunity to submit written feedback, as we've done in the past. And that's a great space to be able to put it in your perspective, either as an individual, or as a part of an organization, or as part of a coalition. So those are all different ways that we're hoping to get people to be able to be part of the development of this strategy, because the strategy is going to be a tool for all of us. It's not just for one agency or one, for the White House. It is really should be a collective voice and a footprint for all of us to sort of move forward. And so that's how I plan to do it, is really do it in community. And I welcome anyone on this call. If you have, like this, a series of webinar, listening session that you already have, I'm happy to join you guys in those conversations and hear from folks what's working, what isn't working. But I want to do it again intentionally, because I know that there's been a lot of that already happening, and I don't want to just repeat and recycle. And I think, again, channeling your fellow discussant, Venita, we also need to define who community is, right? And when we talk about community, what is that? Who are we talking about when we talk about community? And being very explicit about when we talk about community, what we mean by that.
Yeah, two quick follow-up questions. One, just to say and lift up one of the things in the chat from one of our other UWR members, thinking about, as you're doing listening tours, not to forget about lifetime survivors in the process. A passion project also for both Venita and I. So please do not forget. And if you need connections, we can definitely get you connected to the leaders in that movement. And then the follow-up question would be, you're talking a lot about the kind of pre-listening tour. When there are drafts then available of the blueprint, will there be follow-up of any kind with community to give input before a finalized version of the next iteration of the national strategy is around, or is it kind of all pre-input and then something will be produced?
I think it's going to be iterations. And so our goal is to release sort of the next strategy for next World AIDS Day, like to give you guys an idea of sort of the timeline, right? Because the current strategy, as you guys know, takes us to 2025. And so it is my intent to sort of engage folks now in the sort of the data collection piece, if you will. There's been a lot of great reports as well. So not only are we going to be sort of wanting to ask people, but we're going to do our homework as well and see what's out there already. There's been a lot of great work, some of the work that you guys have done on this group. Some other organizations and institutions have also put out some reports. And so the idea is to really synthesize some of that. So it's not just being developed in this little island. And so the information is going to be sort of multi-pronged approach of like gathering information, both of the stuff that's already in motion or published, but also from the perspectives of the written feedback that we get from folks, the verbal feedback that we get. I don't have right now, that's where I'm at, is collecting and then putting in the feedback to paper. I haven't, to be honest, put additional thoughts of like after we get a good draft, what that looks like. So I'm welcome feedback. So I don't want to misspeak and say, hey, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, because I'm not that person. I just honestly haven't gotten that far, because the idea is let's maximize some of this time now. We have these big meetings happening. And the other thing I want to mention also is we also want to go to spaces, like I said earlier, in my sort of my priority areas, go to spaces that are not HIV focused. And so working with organizations that are maybe large Black and Latino civic organizations who are focusing on larger things beyond HIV and hearing from them. And that work, as you guys are very much aware of, takes much more time, because you have to break down the alphabets, you have to break down the acronyms, spell out a little bit more, demystify some of the stuff, but it's important work, right? And so I think some of the listening sessions, when you say tour, I just go to Beyonce. I mean, we're not doing a tour per se, but we are doing a really intentional listening to community, and part of it again is going to spaces that maybe we haven't gone to before. And so, as always, welcome feedback. And I just also want to say before I put myself on mute, is I can't see the chat. So if there's some really good pearls and wisdom, please share them with me maybe after the webinar. One of the beautiful / not beautiful things about the White House is we can't have access to the chat features on these platforms. So I don't see anything in the chat, so I'm not ignoring you if you're making a comment. I apologize. Just want to put that out there.
Thanks for calling that out, Francisco. And we will have some time towards the end of our time for Q&A. And if we do not get to your question today, we're committed to getting those to Francisco and following up with folks.
Francisco, I wanted to mention something that you said, and I really want to just caution. So some of us have been involved with the National HIV/AIDS strategy since the first one, and we've done the reiterations. One of the things we don't have to do, we have not got progress on, and I hope you can help us. After NHAS is done, the federal agencies create an implementation plan. We have no clue to what the status of that implementation. You can ask them what they've heard, but we like to know what they've done. So there's been no status update to see what did they do the last time, how did they progress or not progress. So that's the first thing. It's always, and you're right, we give this information so much. What we don't get is feedback on what we told people and how our information was used. We get taught, really, we're always the guinea pig, but we want to be taught. There should be an iteration, and we love some kind of status of where the agencies are now with the last plan. And then the last thing I want to say before I go to my question is, one of the biggest things in community is transparency. So I know there's implementation plan, you've got a group here that nobody knows how anyone was selected. It may not even be a big deal, but transparency just brings trust in the process. And when there's not trust in the process, people won't trust the results. And so more transparency. And I understand, I work for the federal government. I know it isn't always easy, but I'm just telling you, we've been given input since the first one. We rarely get to see the outcome. And now we want to see a scorecard of what the federal agency have done. And we don't have a shame. Everybody wants to put lipstick on a pig and make it look better. Tell the truth. And we can deal with that. Quality of life or whatever. Black women have the lowest improvement over the last one. So I just wanted to say that before I go to my next question, or is it you, Tyler? Is it me?
It's all you.
Okay. So really, we would love to see what they've done, because we don't know. And we're talking about a new one and they're going to tell you what they heard, but we don't know what they've done. And we're still in the dark. Another critical policy area is invested in solutions that address the root causes of our vulnerability to HIV. I'm so happy to hear you say it's not behavior, but the common message and theme is behavior. That's it's your fault. If you all would just put on a condom or don't have sex while positive, criminalization is all based on that. So that's our vulnerability. So what are your thoughts on the most effective approaches to achieve solutions that address root causes like jobs, apartments, and all that, particularly in the context of a systemic anti-Black racism and economic deprivation? I mean, those things aren't changing yet, and people have talked a whole lot about, we understand the problem, but we ain't seen much in a solution.
100%. I mean, I think we talked about this a little bit earlier. I think, making sure that it's not just about a pill and a shot, right? We know that 100%. And so that's why with the strategy, it's really important to make sure that these different departments beyond HHS are at the table, and not just symbolically, but really rolling up their sleeves and thinking through how can they implement some of this work in their departments, in their agencies, in their offices. And so that's something that I'm really committed to. We just had last month our first, since I've been in this position, our first federal implementation work group. And it included folks from across the different departments that are touching the national HIV strategy. And so part of that is doing that. And, we've talked about, I think it was around the COVID time where we talked about racism as a public health threat. And I think we need to sort of continue to have those conversations of what does that actually mean when we talk about racism and anti-Blackness, anti-transness, and anti-gay, and all these. Unfortunately, there's been this wave of anti a lot of things, and some of that has always been there, right? But I think we've seen, unfortunately, folks be more vocal about it, and that has pushed folks to sort of, we know the impact when people are saying you're not worthy, and how that impacts health-seeking behaviors, how that impacts sort of your profession, your sense of self in terms of education and housing and employment. And so that's sort of what we're trying to do, is thinking through when we talk about the strategy, what are pieces in there that look more than just we need to strengthen the public health piece, but what are these other things that come into play? I think what you talked about, having a scorecard, a report card, I forget how you framed
Or
it.
just knowing where they are. Did they implement
Exactly.
it or not?
So
We don't
we
know.
we are
can't
part
see it.
right now. I'm trying to we're thinking about a report that we want to release for World Days Day for this year, in thinking about as we get ready for the next one. Exactly to your point, is that we don't know, we don't know, what's the whole saying, we don't know where we're going to go if we don't know where we've been, or whatever. I know I'm messing up the whole, I'm really good at messing those up, but basically looking at sort of where are we across these indicators, and also the thing, as you know, it wasn't necessarily written in the HIV strategy. It was written in sort of the implementation plan, but the quality of life piece, what does that actually mean? We know that we saw some of that come out recently through CDC's MMP report, but how do we sort of make sure that we're sort of hitting the mark? And so those are the conversations that we're starting to have to think through what is the next iteration. Traditionally, we've had a lot of these conversations within the federal government. And so my goal in going to community and going to spaces where that is community centric is really hear from community of what they see that we need to do differently. And so that's sort of the intent of my Beyonce tour, as Tyler would call it, is to really sort of think about what would Kawhi Carter do?
But you do understand my point that we can't tell you what to do differently when we don't know what you've done.
100%. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's what I hope for this report that we're starting to conceptualize for World AIDS Day this year is going to hopefully tell that story across the indicators, but also what are some successful models, right? What do we know that is helpful? But I want to make sure that we understand how we're defining success, right? Because what's successful in New York, we know it's not going to be successful in Harlingen, Texas. And so we want to make sure that we want to be careful when we talk about success, because you don't want to sort of, it doesn't always easily translate from community to community. And so there's sort of that tension of showing some success stories, but also knowing that they're within the context, right, of those communities and the public health infrastructure that those communities have. So
I can't wait to see the outfits for the Beyonce tour that you'll be doing. So prepare well, please.
Listen, it might be sort of, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to add my little like sazon to it as well. So we'll have some like Selena outfits in the mix. So we'll just mix it up between Beyonce and Selena. So just
I love it.
in this black and brown unity, right?
Exactly. One of the things that is also constantly on our minds in current time is funding allocation. Constantly worried about the divestment of resources in our communities, and particularly ensuring what resources we do have are getting to the communities that need it the most. So I'm wondering, when we think about the equitable allocation of funding resources for HIV prevention and treatment programs, specifically for Black and Latinx communities, and how crucial that is, how do you envision reimagining conversations around allocation, and what metrics might you use as we measure the impact of new strategies?
I mean, I think, that's always, as you know, in government, there's a lot of eyes and legislation and all that, because the US of A loves them some lawyers, right? And so how we allocate funding it has to be very prescriptive in many regards. That said, in terms of the metrics, to your point, I think we need to look at how many of these organizations are led by community, right? And so we have to also, what is sort of like holding accountable not only the government but also the recipient. So how is reduction looking around health disparities in the program, increasing access to care? How are we defining improved health outcomes? And so those are the conversations that I know that CDC and HRSA and others are looking at, making sure that they're data driven. And so, we recently had, as you guys know, a new set of funds, EHE, ending the HIV epidemic. And the intent of that was to really put money where their need was. And so really looking at how do we focus in areas that need some additional resources and support. In EHE was also an opportunity to test things and do things differently, right? Because it was sort of a new pot of money of resources. As you guys know, funding in HIV hasn't seen an increase in many years, and so this was the first time that we got some new resources, and that was one example of looking, and it was more focused, and this is sort of I obviously was in the seat during that happened, that actually EHE, as you guys know, was part of the Trump administration. That was when EHE was initiated. And so looking at the way that that work has happened, how health departments and CBOs have been part of that. And we also know that EHE wasn't, the National HIV Strategy is sort of all government, right? EHE was also very much focused on certain elements within HHS. It wasn't sort of all the parties that touch the National HIV Strategy. It was, it included SAMHSA, NIH, CDC, and HRSA. And Indian Health Services. And so I think, looking at ways that we do some of these funding allocations, making sure that we're measuring, to your point, the impact. And I think to Venita's point, making sure that we're transparent about when impact isn't happening and being very honest and transparent about that. And I think, there is some vulnerability there when a lot of the work is already being questioned. But at the same time, we know if public health communications 101 is that we need to be honest with what's happening. And so that's some of the work that we have to continue to do, and is making sure that we're transferring the knowledge of what is working, what is not working, and that the community is aware of those successes, but also some of those challenges, right? EHE, as well as our HIV work, as you all know, has never been fully funded to the capacity that. So a lot of those indicators that we see in the strategy in EHE were with the assumption that we're going to get this amount of money, right? But we never got that amount of money. So we can't say that we're missing the mark fully. It's not being honest to say that we're missing the mark, because we're not at where we said we were going to be for 2025 or 2030. Because we never got the money that we were told that we were going to get for 25, 2030. So that's where the challenge is, and we need to make sure we're communicating that with our elected officials, quite honestly. And that's a lot of the work that's outside of the executive office, right? But working with our elected officials to let them know and tell the story about, hey, we haven't got all the money, but this is what we did get, and this is what we're doing with it. And a lot of that story is there's some successes there. And so in public health, we're not quick to sort of say that we're doing great work, because we're just busy doing the work. And so we also need to spend some time and telling those stories. What are those impact stories? What is those little bit but new money that's happening with EHE? How has that sort of allowed us to be more innovative? How has that allowed us to focus in on certain communities that weren't getting the resources in the past? So I'll stop there. Sorry, a lot of caffeine this morning, so it's all working through it.
I'm still on it. I wanted to follow up something that Tyler talked about, and it goes into this idea of resources. And, resources aren't finite, but we seem to find resources for other things we need. And resource allocation becomes, for me, a white supremacy tool to divide our community. So if that group gets it, Black gay men, women may not, or Latinx women may not, or that, and that isn't good for us. It might solve a problem for y'all because y'all don't have to come live with it, but it is not the way. It assumes a scarcity model, but we could spend 80 billion on an election, and where we want abundance, and we don't want to divide our community over resources. And so I just had to get that out, because I always feel like it's, well, they get, but well, there's been a little bump, but bump for who? And we all should benefit and understand that it's a benefit for everybody. And we're not trying to debate against whole person or status neutral versus people living with HIV. We want people negative, and then we want those that are living with HIV well. how do we do it without sacrificing people living with HIV services? That wasn't a question, but I'm asking it.
Yes, 100%. It shouldn't be sort of putting people like, it's not about, hey, how do we like pick up the crumbs? It's like, we need to make more pies. We need more slices. There's not enough resources out there. And so I think, I think there's always, unfortunately, this, oh, you're focusing in this community. What about the rest of what about this community? And I think and we see that with communities, but to your point, we see, oh, you're putting too much emphasis on prevention. What about folks who live with HIV or vice versa? And I think we need more resources in both areas. And I think we've seen when someone is volume suppressed, what that does for the work. We also know that when people have access to prevention tools, what that does for the work. And so we need both. It's not one or the other, but both.
You want me to take this, or you want to do the, okay. So ensuring comprehensive data collection is vital for effective resource allocation. How can we advocate for the CDC and other health departments to capture more inclusive data on immigrants and transgender individuals?
So I think this is, a really important question. I think data collection and surveillance is a very timely conversation that I think we're having across many sort of conversations around data selection and surveillance reports and data and people diagnosed with HIV. I think, CDC right now collects data collection across different areas. And I know that they collect data on gender identity and sexual orientation when it's available. And I think some of those resources, such as like case report forms by healthcare and HIV tester providers, medical records, and then matching those with health department databases. We see some examples with the Right and Right program. One way that we could all sort of get more richer, maybe not more richer, but anyway. One way to encourage and collaborate with our health departments to educate healthcare providers and community-based organizations on the importance of providing this information. So as you know, the information that CDC gets is sort of like a telephone game, right? And so we need to sort of go through that telephone and make sure that people that are providing that information are giving that to the health department, making sure that the health department understands the importance of a full collection, of making sure that we identify all people and some of the gender identity, sexual orientation. I think the issue around immigrants, migrant populations living with HIV is really important. I know there's a lot more work that needs to happen, especially if we see a lot new arrivals to this country. I think it's really important to continue to work with health departments and sort of data protection issues come into play and making sure we identify and enhance collaboration with those providers. CDC does not currently collect specific information on immigration status. They do, in many instances when available, collect country of origin. And so I think that's a conversation that I want to continue to have with CDC. That's not, in full transparency, not my area of expertise. But that's something that I know that we need to have those conversations. Not only is it about collecting, but how do we protect that information, right? We know the importance of making sure that the data that we have is protected. And so that's the other piece of the conversation that I want to have with folks is collecting richer data, but also making sure that we're protecting it for the obvious reasons that I don't have to say why.
Thank you for that,
Yes.
Tyler.
We've gotten a lot of really great comments in the chat, which we're going to make sure that you get after the fact, but we've also been getting some questions throughout. So I'm going to pivot over and ask some of the questions that folks have submitted. One of them is asking if you could talk just a little bit more about your thoughts on HIV and aging, considering the goal of EHE and getting to zero by 2030. And I think I would personally use my facilitator privilege to add to that and say, how are you thinking of that, both in the traditional sense of the aging discussion, which has been those, 50 plus, 55 plus years of age, but also of lifetime survivors?
Yeah, I mean, I think the HIV and aging piece, I know that our buddy Harold Phillips, who was my predecessor, was one of his focus areas, and I picked up the baton and carried it as well. As I mentioned, we're sort of conceptualizing how can we really focus in on HIV and aging from various vantage points. From the research side, like what other information do we need to capture from the research side around HIV and aging? What are the sort of these issues that we know that we need to be prepared for? Working with the healthcare providers who maybe are not asking the questions, making sure that we have clinicians who are supporting folks living with HIV, but also people who are HIV negative, making sure they're asking them the same questions, right? Just because you get older doesn't mean you stop having sex, right? And so I think when I talk about HIV and aging, I'm actually looking at it from both perspectives of both someone living with HIV, but also someone who's not living with HIV, but still needs to have some prevention tools sort of offered to them and getting tested, et cetera. And I know that's a lot of conversation that's happening right now at CDC around guidelines and stuff like that. I think the other piece around HIV and aging is making sure that the institutions that have been established over the course of the years for people with HIV are sort of looked at and say, how do we strengthen them? Because I think, as you guys know, back in the day, unfortunately, we weren't living that long, right? And so those institutions were not built with that understanding. And so we need to sort of revisit it and see, are there any sort of recalibrations that need to happen to the existing infrastructure that we have in our HIV space? And then there's also a space that historically wasn't expecting us, right? And so how do we sort of, those entities, those programs, how do we make sure that they welcome us with open arms and that they're sort of serving us in our needs? And so there's a lot of sort of from the research side, from the healthcare provision side, from the policy side, but also from the communication side, and making sure that, for example, the campaigns that we put out there look like us and look like people living with HIV and aging with HIV. And so there's a lot of different sort of, there's layers to this work that I hope to explore and hopefully to translate that into sort of the national strategy.
Before Tyler asks his next question, because I can't see the chat, you didn't address the aging for lifetime survivors who were either born or acquired it as a young child, and their system is totally different from someone who acquired it as a young adult. And I used to think there was a lot of research on that, but there isn't. So how are we going to, there's a whole separate line, I think, for lifetime survivors that are a little different than for the rest of us.
Absolutely. And I think the lifetime survivors, like down the lines, all that, we need to make sure that, I think you mentioned this earlier, Venita, about just using us and sort of getting to get the information, but how do we lean into these lifetime survivors, as well as the dandelions that were born with HIV, to learn from them, not as sort of people carrying the health, living in it with a health condition, right, but how do they help inform, they're not just science, they're human, right? And how do we lean into them to make sure that they are informing the change that we need to change in some of these systems that I mentioned earlier? They need to be part of those conversations and helping shape and writing paper to pen to some of that. So I'm sorry that I didn't acknowledge that, but definitely needs to be at the table. And I think, to your point, there's different complexities with people who were born with HIV, right? They don't know anything else. And so how do we address some of that? There's also a lot of, we don't talk a lot because they're stigmatized, is mental health, right? Like making sure that we're serving people with all needs. And that could be longtime survivors down the lines. It could be someone, like I said, when I received my diagnosis, I wasn't a lifetime survivor, but I had to deal with my mental health issues. And so that's another piece. As we're aging with HIV, what does that look like? What does that mean for us in our mental health?
One of the lifetime survivors told me one day, she said, Venita, our first trauma was our birth. Okay. So go ahead, Tyler. I just want to hammer it home. And I had a hard time as an adult coming to terms with it. I just can't imagine what a child did. Go ahead, Tyler.
Yeah, I guess just to close the loop on that, I was recently just at a day-long institute that the O'Neill Institute put on with lifetime survivors. And I
know.
think I think you know, the moment is here. They were loud and clear on the stage of USCHA last year about the demands that they have, and there have been increased spotlight on them as individuals, but I think it's been a lot of listening and not a lot of doing. And I think that they're really looking for follow-up, and someone to really sit down and to understand the complexity of their experience, and to put some real action planning behind how not only the National HIV/AIDS strategy might reflect their experience and plans to address the rest of their lifetime needs, but also how they will be directly involved in the pipeline of leadership moving forward to ensure that they don't continuously get left behind. We are almost at the end of our time together, but I thought I'd ask one final question that is kind of bridges a question we had and that came in from the group. So I guess we're wondering, how do you believe we can work together to bring about Black liberation in your work? And what are the ways that you think the broader community can help support you to be successful in your role?
I mean, I think in the earlier comment, I think liberation is about pushing the systems. And I think liberation for me also is about the joy. And I think this work is not easy. And I think that's so I think I say this work, and when I had the convening 2 weeks ago with the young folks, the Black, brown, queer young folks who came to the White House, I said, this work is not easy. You know, there's going to be times where you're just like, you're hitting yourself against your head against the wall. And I think for us to liberate is that we also need to see ourselves outside of the oppression, right? And so outside of these systems, and that really questioning, and I think a lot of the folks on this call do that day in and day out. But I think also, including myself, I don't think we take enough time to sit with the joy of that we're here today and we're here for a purpose. And I think the support that all of us need is that solidarity in that work. And that I think a lot of times I remember feeling like an island, like just doing the work by myself. And then I would go to the conferences and sort of see people and meet people and have dinner and dance with people and just have, you know, and sort of, because this work is long term, right? You know, we're not ending HIV tomorrow. And even when we're ending HIV, what does that actually mean, right? I think regardless of if we're ending new infections, you're not ending me, you're not ending people with HIV. But what you can do is you could end the disparities. You could end the unneeded deaths associated with some of the complications there. So that's what we need to push, right? When we talk about ending, we could end the stigma, right? We could end the discrimination for people like me and many of us. And so I think what we need is what I need and what y'all need, I'm sure, I don't want to speak for y'all, but is just sort of making sure that we take time to like dance and laugh and smile and enjoy and give a hug, because this working isn't easy. But then also what I need from you guys in particular is to push, right? I did not come on this webinar with the expectation of like soft questions, especially with the two of you on this on this webinar. And I think there's going to be times that we're not going to be on the same page for X, Y, and Z reasons. When I'm at the couch with my own family, right? We're not always going to get it, you know, be on the same page for different things. And I think, but at the end of the day, we're a family. And I think I see the HIV community as a family. I think, and we need to continue to sort of push ourselves. And I think like in all relationships, we need to grow together, right? And part of that is pushing ourselves. Part of it is also understanding that there's different ways to do different things, right? And so the way that Tyler's going to do something is going to be different. The way that Venita is going to do something versus the way Francisco is going to do something. But at the end of the day, as long as we're going towards the same direction, the same finish line. If Tyler wants to wear glitter and Venita wants to wear stripes and I want to wear chia pants, like that's fine. But as long as the main thing is that we're all walking towards that finish line together and making sure that we're looking back in case I see Tyler back there, I'm going to wait and pull his hand over so we walk over the finish line together. And I think that's what we need in this work, is that solidarity, not sort of putting each other against each other, but really working this as a collective.
Well, my final statement would say, and I want to challenge you too, because we asked quite a few questions that started with Black liberation or Black and brown folks. And that doesn't seem to be an area that you've talked about a lot. And I'd love to have more conversation, because you can't look at this epidemic and not see that HIV is a racial justice issue when it's this disproportionately Black. And we can't get anyone in the federal government to say those words. You can't solve a problem that you cannot speak to. And so I look forward to working with you. I look forward to talking about women, because we don't do enough of that. I wish everyone was angry that Black women led all women with HIV, but because that gender and that race intersection, it doesn't seem to be a big problem. So we're here to work with you, Francisco. We're here to push, and me and you have talked before, but I really do admire your humanism and your compassion. And we're also here to educate, because you can't understand my experience here and I can't understand yours, but we all want the same thing, I think, in terms of, I want to see it say ending the epidemic, but ensuring the care for people living with HIV. And then until it says that, what it says to me is we are only preventing and giving the rest of y'all a pill, because there's still David Holgrave, I've talked to all these people who said, Venita, I can't get to zero, no model without a vaccine. So I would love to see ending the epidemic, talk about ending the epidemic, but ensuring the quality of care for people living with HIV, so that we can all feel part of that conversation versus ending something that I can't cure. So thank you so much for your time. You know, I'm forceful just because I'm passionate, not because I have anything against you. I'm so excited that you're there. And Tyler, thank you. And United We Rise, all power to our people. And Black liberation, when Blacks are liberated, everybody liberated. So I'm just gonna stick with that. Black women in particular, and I want to see it all. My pronouns are she, her, and Aya, because I understand I have families from more than one race inside me, and it is okay. So thank you so much.
Appreciate you.
And it's always hard to follow up that, so I will just echo my dear friend Venita in saying thank you for joining us on the couch today. We're looking forward to part 2 of this series. The date will be announced in the weeks ahead, so please stay connected to United We Rise on social media and continue the conversation. We will follow up with all the great questions we weren't able to get to today. And thanks again so much for joining us.